Jondrette comes near weeping. The hovel was so dark that people coming from without felt on entering it the effect produced on entering a cellar. The two newcomers advanced, therefore, with a certain hesitation, being hardly able to distinguish the vague forms surrounding them, while they could be clearly seen and scrutinized by the eyes of the inhabitants of the garret, who were accustomed to this twilight. Leblanc approached, with his sad but kindly look, and said to Jondrette the father, "Monsieur, in this package you will find some new clothes and some woolen stockings and blankets." "Our angelic benefactor overwhelms us," said Jondrette, bowing to the very earth. Then, bending down to the ear of his eldest daughter, while the two visitors were engaged in examining this lamentable interior, he added in a low and rapid voice, "Hey, what did I say? Duds. No money. They are all alike. By the way, how was the letter to that old blockhead signed?" "Fabantou," replied the girl. "The dramatic artist, good. It was lucky for Jondrette that this had occurred to him, for at the very moment, Leblanc turned to him, and said to him with the air of a person who is seeking to recall a name, "I see that you are greatly to be pitied, monsieur." "Fabantou," replied Jondrette quickly. "Monsieur Fabantou, yes, that is it. I remember. Dramatic artist, sir, and one who has had some success." Here Jondrette evidently judged the moment propitious for capturing the philanthropist. He exclaimed with an accent which smacked at the same time of the vainglory of the mountebank at fairs, and the humility of the mendicant on the highway, "A pupil of Talma. Sir, I am a pupil of Talma. Fortune formerly smiled on me. Alas! Now it is misfortune's turn. You see, my benefactor, no bread, no fire. My poor babes have no fire. My only chair has no seat. A broken pane. And in such weather. My spouse in bed. Ill. Poor woman," said Leblanc. "My child wounded," added Jondrette. The child, diverted by the arrival of the strangers, had fallen to contemplating the young lady, and had ceased to sob. "Cry. Bawl," said Jondrette to her in a low voice. At the same time he pinched her sore hand. All this was done with the talent of a juggler. The little girl gave vent to loud shrieks. The adorable young girl, whom Marius, in his heart, called his Ursule, approached her hastily. "Poor, dear child," said she. "You see, my beautiful young lady," pursued Jondrette her bleeding wrist. "It came through an accident while working at a machine to earn 6 sous a day. It may be necessary to cut off her arm." "Really?" said the old gentleman, in alarm. The little girl, taking this seriously, fell to sobbing more violently than ever. "Alas! Yes, my benefactor," replied the father. For several minutes, Jondrette had been scrutinizing the benefactor in a singular fashion. As he spoke, he seemed to be examining the other attentively, as though seeking to summon up his recollections. All at once, profiting by a moment when the newcomers were questioning the child with interest as to her injured hand, he passed near his wife, who lay in her bed with a stupid and dejected air, and said to her in a rapid but very low tone, "Take a look at that man." Then, turning to Leblanc, and continuing his lamentations, "You see, sir, all the clothing that I have is my wife's chemise. And all torn at that. In the depths of winter. I can't go out for lack of a coat. If I had a coat of any sort, I would go and see Mademoiselle Mars, who knows me and is very fond of me. Does she not still reside in the Rue de la Tour des Dames? Do you know, sir? We played together in the provinces. I shared her laurels. Célimène would come to my succor, sir. Elmire would bestow alms on Bélisaire. But no, nothing. And not a sou in the house. My wife ill, and not a sou. My daughter dangerously injured, not a sou. My wife suffers from fits of suffocation. It comes from her age, and besides, her nervous system is affected. She ought to have assistance, and my daughter also. But the doctor, but the apothecary, how am I to pay them? I would kneel to a penny, sir. Such is the condition to which the arts are reduced. And do you know, my charming young lady, and you, my generous protector, do you know, you who breathe forth virtue and goodness, and who perfume that church where my daughter sees you every day when she says her prayers? For I have brought up my children religiously, sir. I did not want him to take to the theatre. Ah, the hussies! If I catch them tripping. I do not jest, that I don't. I read them lessons on honor, on morality, on virtue. Ask them. They have got to walk straight. They are none of your unhappy wretches who begin by having no family, and end by espousing the public. One is Mademoiselle Nobody, and one becomes Madame Everybody. Deuce take it. None of that in the Fabantou family. I mean to bring 'em up virtuously, and they shall be honest, and nice, and believe in God, by the sacred name. Well, sir, my worthy sir, do you know what is going to happen tomorrow? Tomorrow is the 4th day of February, the fatal day, the last day of grace allowed me by my landlord. If by this evening I have not paid my rent, tomorrow my oldest daughter, my spouse with her fever, my child with her wound, we shall all four be turned out of here and thrown into the street, on the boulevard, without shelter, in the rain, in the snow. There, sir, I owe for 4 quarters, a whole year. That is to say, 60 francs. Jondrette lied. 4 quarters would have amounted to only 40 francs, and he could not owe 4. Because 6 months had not elapsed since Marius had paid for 2. Leblanc drew 5 francs from his pocket and threw them on the table. Jondrette found time to mutter in the ear of his eldest daughter. The scoundrel! What does he think I can do with his 5 francs? That won't pay me for my chair and pane of glass. That's what comes of incurring expenses. In the meanwhile, Leblanc had removed the large brown great coat which he wore over his blue coat, and had thrown it over the back of the chair. Monsieur Fabantou, he said, these 5 francs are all that I have about me, but I shall now take my daughter home, and I will return this evening. It is this evening that you must pay, is it not? Jondrette's face lighted up with a strange expression. He replied vivaciously, yes, respected sir. At 8 o'clock, I must be at my landlord's. I will be here at 6, and I will fetch you the 60 francs. My benefactor! Exclaimed Jondrette, overwhelmed. And he added, in a low tone, take a good look at him, wife. Leblanc had taken the arm of the young girl, once more, and had turned towards the door. Farewell until this evening, my friends, said he. 6 o'clock, said Jondrette. 6 o'clock precisely. At that moment, the overcoat lying on the chair caught the eye of the elder Jondrette girl. You are forgetting your coat, sir, said she. Jondrette darted an annihilating look at his daughter, accompanied by a formidable shrug of the shoulders. Leblanc turned back and said, with a smile, I have not forgotten it, I am leaving it. "O my protector," said Jondrette, "my august benefactor, I melt into tears. Permit me to accompany you to your carriage." "If you come out," answered M. Leblanc, "put on this coat. It really is very cold." Jondrette did not need to be told twice. He hastily donned the brown greatcoat. And all three went out, Jondrette preceding the two strangers. Chapter X. Tariff of licensed cabs. 2 francs an hour. Marius had lost nothing of this entire scene, and yet, in reality, had seen nothing. His eyes had remained fixed on the young girl. His heart had, so to speak, seized her and wholly enveloped her from the moment of her very first step in that garret. During her entire stay there, he had lived that life of ecstasy which suspends material perceptions and precipitates the whole soul on a single point. He contemplated, not that girl, but that light which wore a satin pelisse and a velvet bonnet. The star Sirius might have entered the room, and he would not have been any more dazzled. While the young girl was engaged in opening the package, unfolding the clothing and the blankets, questioning the sick mother kindly, and the little injured girl tenderly, he watched her every movement, he sought to catch her words. He knew her eyes, her brow, her beauty, her form, her walk. He did not know the sound of her voice. He had once fancied that he had caught a few words at the Luxembourg, but he was not absolutely sure of the fact. He would have given 10 years of his life to hear it, in order that he might bear away in his soul a little of that music. But everything was drowned in the lamentable exclamations and trumpet bursts of Jondrette. This added a touch of genuine wrath to Marius' ecstasy. He devoured her with his eyes. He could not believe that it really was that divine creature whom he saw in the midst of those vile creatures in that monstrous lair. It seemed to him that he beheld a hummingbird in the midst of toads. When she took her departure, he had but one thought: to follow her, to cling to her trace, not to quit her until he learned where she lived, not to lose her again, at least, after having so miraculously rediscovered her. He leaped down from the commode and seized his hat. As he laid his hand on the lock of the door, and was on the point of opening it, a sudden reflection caused him to pause. The corridor was long, the staircase steep, Jondrette was talkative, M. Leblanc had, no doubt, not yet regained his carriage. If, on turning round in the corridor, or on the staircase, he were to catch sight of him, Marius, in that house, he would, evidently, take the alarm, and find means to escape from him again, and this time it would be final. What was he to do? Should he wait a little? But while he was waiting, the carriage might drive off. Marius was perplexed. At last he accepted the risk and quitted his room. There was no one in the corridor. He hastened to the stairs. There was no one on the staircase. He descended in all haste, and reached the boulevard in time to see a fiacre turning the corner of the Rue du Petit Banquier, on its way back to Paris. Marius rushed headlong in that direction. On arriving at the angle of the boulevard, he caught sight of the fiacre again, rapidly descending the Rue Mouffetard. The carriage was already a long way off, and there was no means of overtaking it. What? Run after it? Impossible. And besides, the people in the carriage would assuredly notice an individual running at full speed in pursuit of a fiacre, and the father would recognize him. At that moment, wonderful and unprecedented good luck, Marius perceived an empty cab passing along the boulevard. There was but one thing to be done: to jump into this cab and follow the fiacre. That was sure, efficacious, and free from danger. Marius made the driver a sign to halt, and called to him. By the hour. Marius wore no cravat. He had on his working coat, which was destitute of buttons. His shirt was torn along one of the plaits on the bosom. The driver halted, winked, and held out his left hand to Marius, rubbing his forefinger gently with his thumb. "What is it?" said Marius. "Pay in advance," said the coachman. Marius recollected that he had but 16 sous about him. "How much?" he demanded. 40 sous. "I will pay on my return." The driver's only reply was to whistle the air of La Palace and to whip up his horse. Marius stared at the retreating cabriolet with a bewildered air. For the lack of 24 sous, he was losing his joy, his happiness, his love. He had seen, and he was becoming blind again. He reflected bitterly, and it must be confessed, with profound regret, on the 5 francs which he had bestowed, that very morning, on that miserable girl. If he had had those 5 francs, he would have been saved, he would have been born again, he would have emerged from the limbo and darkness, he would have made his escape from isolation and spleen, from his widowed state. He might have re-knotted the black thread of his destiny to that beautiful golden thread, which had just floated before his eyes and had broken at the same instant, once more. He returned to his hovel in despair. He might have told himself that Leblanc had promised to return in the evening, and that all he had to do was to set about the matter more skillfully, so that he might follow him on that occasion. But, in his contemplation, it is doubtful whether he had heard this. As he was on the point of mounting the staircase, he perceived, on the other side of the boulevard, near the deserted wall skirting the rue de la barrière-des-gobelins, Jondrette, wrapped in the philanthropist's great coat, engaged in conversation with one of those men of disquieting aspect who have been dubbed by common consent, prowlers of the barriers. People of equivocal face, of suspicious monologues, who present the air of having evil minds, and who generally sleep in the daytime, which suggests the supposition that they work by night. These 2 men, standing there motionless and in conversation, in the snow which was falling in whirlwinds, formed a group that a policeman would surely have observed, but which Marius hardly noticed. Still, in spite of his mournful preoccupation, he could not refrain from saying to himself that this prowler of the barriers with whom Jondrette was talking resembled a certain Panchaud, alias Printanier, alias Big Renail, whom Courfeyrac had once pointed out to him as a very dangerous nocturnal roamer. This man's name the reader has learned in the preceding book. This Panchaud, alias Printanier, alias Big Renail, figured later on in many criminal trials, and became a notorious rascal. He was at that time only a famous rascal. Today he exists in the state of tradition among ruffians and assassins. He was at the head of a school towards the end of the last reign. And in the evening, at nightfall, at the hour when groups form and talk in whispers, he was discussed at La Force in the Fosse aux Lions. One might even, in that prison, precisely at the spot where the sewer which served the unprecedented escape, in broad daylight, of 30 prisoners, in 1843, passes under the culvert, read his name, Panchaud, audaciously carved by his own hand on the wall of the sewer, during one of his attempts at flight. In 1832, the police already had their eye on him, but he had not as yet made a serious beginning.